Around 1300 CE, thousands of people simply walked away from North America's greatest city, Cahokia, a metropolis of 20,000 souls that rivaled London itself. Within decades, the mounds were swallowed by grass, the streets erased, and an entire civilization vanished so completely that America forgot it ever existed. Before it vanished, Cahokia was real. Between 1050 and 1200 CE, in the floodplain where the Mississippi River bends near present-day St. Louis, Illinois, a city rose that no European would see or record or remember. At its peak around 1100 CE, Cahokia held between 10,000 and 20,000 residents, more people than London at the same moment. The city sprawled across 6 square miles. It had a planned grid of streets. It had a central plaza larger than 40 football fields. And at its heart stood Monk's Mound, an earthen pyramid 100 feet tall, built grain by hand over 300 years. The people who built it were Mississippian, a culture that had learned to farm maize intensively, to trade across a continent, to organize labor at a scale that required administration, hierarchy, and vision. Cahokia was their capital. Archaeological surveys have documented 80 surviving mounds within the city limits, though originally there were 120. Palaces stood on the largest mounds. Common people lived in rectangular wooden houses in the grid below. They worked in craft production, making shell ornaments, stone tools, pottery with specific designs that marked status and identity. Trade goods arrived from the Great Lakes, the Gulf Coast, the Appalachian Mountains. Cahokia was not isolated. It was a node in a vast network. Life there was structured, organized, and by all evidence sustained. The Mississippian people of Cahokia had solved problems of food production, resource distribution, and collective labor that required institutions, chiefs, priests, administrators, engineers. This was not a village. This was not a ceremonial site visited seasonally. This was an actual city where families lived year-round, where children were born, where the old died, where economies cycled through seasons and generations. For roughly 150 years, it worked. And then, around 1200 CE, something changed. The ground itself was shrinking. Between 1200 and 1250 CE, the Mississippi River's climate entered a new rhythm, cooler, drier, less predictable. Tree ring data shows this shift clearly. The great forests that had sustained Cahokia's woodworkers and builders began to thin. Fuel became scarcer. Game moved elsewhere. The cornfields that fed 10,000 people needed water they could no longer rely on. At the same time, Cahokia's appetite was consuming itself. Archaeologists have counted at least 14,000 wooden posts embedded in the earth, part of a massive defensive palisade built around 1100 CE and rebuilt twice over the next century. Each post was a tree felled, stripped, and driven into the ground. The palimpsest of post holes reveals obsessive reconstruction. Something was being defended. Something was being feared. But the institutions holding the city together were fraying. Evidence suggests the authority of Cahokia's leaders, likely a hereditary elite centered on Monk's Mound, was no longer absolute. Satellite mounds on the city's perimeter show signs of decline earlier than the core. Some neighborhoods were abandoned by 1250 CE. The archaeological record here is fragmentary. Scholars debate whether this reflects slow drift or accelerating fracture. What's certain is this: between 1250 and 1300, the city did not collapse all at once. It fragmented, and yet no one left a record of why. Between 1200 and 1350 CE, Cahokia simply stopped. Not overnight, But in a span of 150 years, a city that had housed 20,000 people, roughly equivalent to London's population in 1350, contracted, emptied, and was abandoned to the grass and the Mississippi floodplain. Archaeologists call this process depopulation. The term is bloodless. What it means is, people left. Families gathered what they could carry. Entire lineages dispersed. By 1350 CE, the streets were silent. The timeline is fragmentary because Cahokia left no written record of its own decline. We read it instead in the archaeological stratigraphy, the layers of earth and ash and refuse that accumulate when a city breathes. Ceramic styles change around 1200 CE, suggesting the arrival of new populations or the departure of old ones. The construction of new mounds slows, then stops. Residential neighborhoods in the outer rings, where commoners lived, show signs of being abandoned first. The central precincts held longer. By 1300 CE, even the elite districts were emptying. What we do not have are crisis records. No accounts of plague. No records of war. No administrative tablets detailing a famine. No oral histories passed down through descendants, because the descendants scattered and the knowledge dispersed with them, carried away in memory, then lost when those memories died without being written. The environmental record is clearer if contested among scholars. Between 1150 and 1300 CE, tree ring data indicates a period of increased variability in rainfall and temperature. The Mississippi River's hydrology shifted. Game populations in the region declined. The corn surpluses that had sustained the city's growth became harder to guarantee. But scholars debate how severe these shifts actually were. Could Cahokia have adapted? Should it have survived? Or did the city collapse not from a single catastrophe, but from something slower and more corrosive, the loss of faith in the institutions that held it together? That question, whether Cahokia fell or chose to dissolve, would preoccupy archaeologists for more than a century. When Cahokia's last residents departed, they left behind a silence that would last 400 years. No one lived at Monk's Mound. No one tended the plazas. The grand metropolis that had rivaled London in size simply ceased to exist in living memory. By 1500, when Europeans arrived on the continent, Cahokia was already a ghost, a place of grass-covered hills with no names attached, no stories passed down, no continuity of knowledge. The Mississippian culture that built it had fragmented into dozens of smaller nations scattered across the Southeast and Midwest. The institutional networks that had sustained 15,000 people had dissolved completely. What remained were 80 mounds dotting the floodplain near present-day St. Louis, Illinois, monuments to a vanished world. For 3 centuries, no one understood what these mounds meant. European settlers assumed they were natural hills. Native Americans living in the region in the 1700s and 1800s had no oral tradition connecting them to Cahokia. That knowledge had been lost. When Thomas Jefferson excavated a mound in Virginia in 1784, he sparked archaeological curiosity, but Cahokia itself remained a mystery. The city's collapse had been so complete, so thorough, that by the time anyone thought to ask what these mounds were, no one could answer. The evidence lay buried. The witnesses were gone. But in 1891, a St. Louis businessman named James Maguire would stand before those silent hills and ask a question that would consume the next 50 years of his life. What if someone had actually built this? What if this wasn't nature at all, but the remains of a deliberate, planned metropolis? What he found beneath Monk's Mound would force America to completely reimagine its own past. Today, 80 mounds still rise from the Illinois floodplain, silent monuments to a city that time forgot. When archaeologist Warren King Moorhead began his systematic excavations in 1909, he faced an almost impossible task, proving that Cahokia had been real at all. The grass-covered earthworks scattered across present-day Collinsville looked like natural hills to most observers. Moorhead's team dug into Monk's Mound itself, the largest, and found layered evidence of intentional construction: clay, stone, and soil arranged in precise stages over centuries. They recovered pottery sherds, tools, and burial remains that confirmed people had built this. By 1925, the picture was undeniable. Cahokia's population had peaked around 1100 CE at perhaps 20,000 souls, larger than London at the same moment. The city possessed a planned grid of streets, specialized craft districts, a central plaza, and a wooden palisade encircling the core. Then, between 1200 and 1350 CE, it emptied. Scholars now point to converging pressures: a cooling climate reduced harvests. The Mississippi's floodplain became unpredictable. Resource competition intensified. The institution that held the city together, likely a theocratic authority centered on the mound complex, fractured under strain. No warfare scars, no plague pits, no dramatic final event, just a slow unraveling. The population dispersed into smaller settlements. The mounds stood empty. Oral traditions that might have preserved Cahokia's memory vanished with the Mississippian culture itself. By the time European explorers arrived 500 years later, the city was mythology. What we know comes entirely from soil, from the patient work of archaeologists, and from one artifact class that archaeologists still debate fiercely today: thousands of shell beads and exotic stone traded from sources 500 miles away, trade networks that suggest Cahokia's reach extended far beyond its walls. Cahokia remains one of history's most profound mysteries, a city that rose to magnificent complexity only to disappear without explanation or memory. Another file is already open, the case of a vanished culture whose story was nearly lost forever. Subscribe to the archive for more forgotten histories buried beneath our feet.